He was a small, quiet boy who entered the old community hall holding his hands close to his chest, as if trying to protect something fragile inside him, and the room he stepped into was not welcoming, because it was filled with adults dressed neatly, men with confident postures and women who spoke in low, assured voices. And they barely noticed him at first except as an odd detail that did not belong, and the boy wore clothes that were clean but worn, showing signs of long use and careful mending, and his shoes were scuffed from years of walking and standing and waiting, and his hair was neatly combed by someone who cared deeply even if resources were limited. The piano stood at the front of the hall, polished and proud, a symbol of culture and education and refinement, and it belonged to a world the boy had only seen from a distance, because his life had been shaped by necessity rather than opportunity, and music for him had never been about performance or praise but about survival, comfort, and expression, and he had learned to play not through lessons or tutors, but by listening, watching, and practicing whenever he found a piano that was not locked away from him. People in the room began to notice him as he moved closer to the piano, and their expressions shifted from indifference to curiosity, and then to amusement, and some whispered quietly, while others did not bother to lower their voices, and they commented on his size, his clothes, and the confidence it took for someone like him to approach an instrument that many believed required status to touch, and their laughter was not cruel in intent but careless and dismissive, and it carried the weight of assumptions that had been built over years of comfort and privilege. The boy heard the laughter and felt it like a pressure against his chest, but he did not react outwardly, because he had learned early in life that reacting often made things worse. And instead he focused on the piano, the smooth surface of the keys, and the familiar shape of the instrument that felt more like a friend than an obstacle, and his hands trembled slightly, not from fear of failure, but from the awareness that this moment mattered more than anyone else in the room could understand. His story had begun long before this moment in a small, crowded home where silence was rare and responsibilities were heavy, and he had grown up watching his parent work long hours with little reward, and music had been the one thing that brought calm into their lives. And there was an old upright piano in a nearby building where his parent cleaned at night. And sometimes after the work was done, the boy would be allowed to sit and play quietly while the halls were empty, and those late nights became his classroom. And the piano became his teacher. He learned by repetition and memory, pressing keys, until the sounds made sense and matched the melodies he carried in his mind. And there was no applause, no audience, and no promise of a future built on music, only the simple joy of creating something beautiful in a world that often felt harsh and unkind. And over time his fingers grew stronger and more confident, and his ear more precise, and music became a language through which he understood himself. Back in the hall, the laughter grew louder as someone made a comment about how the piano was probably larger than the boy himself, and a few people smiled, expecting him to retreat embarrassed and ashamed. But he did not move away, and instead he took a deep breath and sat down slowly on the bench, adjusting his position carefully, as if respecting the instrument and the space, and this quiet confidence surprised a few onlookers who paused their laughter, unsure of what to expect next. The boy placed his hands gently above the keys without playing, and in that stillness memories flooded him, memories of late nights, tired hands, and whispered encouragement from the one person who believed in him without question. And he reminded himself that this was not about proving anything to the people watching, but about honoring the music that had shaped him and carried him through moments of doubt and fear. A man near the front shook his head, smiling, as if indulging a harmless fantasy, and another leaned back, crossing his arms, convinced that this would be over quickly. And the boy sensed their skepticism. But it no longer controlled him, because he had learned that belief in oneself often begins in isolation and grows quietly long before the world catches up. The room settled into a tense anticipation, and the laughter faded into murmurs, and the boy felt the weight of many eyes on his back. And for a moment he hesitated, not because he doubted his ability, but because he understood the power of what he was about to do, and how it could change how he was seen, and perhaps how he saw himself. And with a steady breath he prepared to play, knowing that whatever happened next would be honest and true. This moment was not the beginning of his talent, but it was the first time it would be witnessed, and that realization filled him with a mix of fear and calm. And as his fingers hovered just above the keys, he felt grounded, ready, and present, and the room held its breath, unknowingly standing at the edge of a moment that would challenge their assumptions and reveal a truth they had not expected to face. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. The moment his fingers touched the keys, the room changed in a way that no one could have predicted. And the sound that emerged was not loud or dramatic, but clear, steady, and full of intention. And that single note carried a depth that silenced every whisper and stopped every movement, because it did not sound like a child guessing or experimenting. It sounded like someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. The boy remained still except for his hands, and his posture was calm, grounded, and focused. And his eyes stayed on the keys, not looking at the people around him, because he had learned that music required complete presence. And the piano responded to him gently, as if recognizing his touch and welcoming him back, and the next few notes followed, slowly forming a simple melody that flowed naturally without effort. People leaned forward almost without realizing it, and a few exchanged confused glances, because what they were hearing did not match the image they had created in their minds, and the laughter that had filled the room earlier felt distant and inappropriate now. and some felt a quiet discomfort as they recognized how quickly they had judged the boy based on appearance. The music continued growing richer and more confident, and the boy allowed himself to relax into it, letting memory guide him rather than thought, and each note connected to the next with care and purpose. And there was no rush in his playing because he understood that music was not about speed or volume, but about feeling and control, and that understanding showed in the way he shaped the sound. A man near the back straightened his posture, his smile fading as he listened closely, and another uncrossed his arms, placing his hands together, as if watching something important unfold. And a woman who had laughed earlier now covered her mouth, lightly surprised by the emotion rising in her chest, and she wondered how such depth could come from someone so young and overlooked. The boy moved into a slightly more complex passage, and his fingers danced across the keys with ease, showing discipline that could only come from long hours of practice. And his small hands navigated the piano, confidently finding each note without hesitation, and the melody carried warmth, sadness, and hope all at once. And though no words were spoken, everyone in the room understood that this music came from a place of experience rather than imitation. As he played, he remembered the cold nights when the building was empty and his parent cleaned quietly nearby, and how the sound of the piano filled the space, making it feel less lonely. And he remembered practicing the same phrases over and over until his fingers ached, and how he never stopped because music was the one thing that made him feel seen, even when no one was watching. The audience felt drawn into that private world without knowing its details, and the honesty of the performance created a connection that surprised them, because it bypassed logic and expectation and went straight to something deeply human and shared. And in that moment, the boy was no longer a poor child at a piano, but a voice speaking through sound. Someone near the front shifted in their seat, struggling to reconcile what they were witnessing with the assumptions they had made earlier. And a sense of humility began to spread quietly through the room as people realized that talent does not announce itself loudly and often grows strongest in silence and patience rather than praise. The boy reached the end of the short piece and allowed the final note to fade naturally without forcing an ending, and he lifted his hands gently from the keys, letting the sound settle into the room. And for a brief moment, there was complete silence, not because people were unsure how to react, but because they needed time to absorb what they had just heard. The boy stayed seated, his hands resting in his lap, his breathing steady and calm, and he did not look around for approval because he had played honestly, and that was enough for him, and the stillness around him felt heavy but not threatening, and it carried a respect that had not existed before. A man finally cleared his throat but said nothing, and the sound felt awkward against the quiet, and another person lowered their head slightly as if acknowledging a mistake, and though no one spoke, yet something had shifted in the way they saw the boy and perhaps in how they saw themselves. The boy slowly stood from the bench and stepped back, giving space to the piano and the room, and as he did, people noticed how small he looked again, how young and vulnerable. And this contrast only deepened the impact of what they had heard, because it reminded them that greatness does not always come wrapped in confidence or privilege. As he moved away from the piano, the boy felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty, because he did not know what would happen next, and he did not expect praise or reward, but he knew that he had honored the music and the effort he had given it over the years, and that knowledge brought him peace regardless of the response. The audience remained quiet, watching him, unsure of how to respond to the truth they had just witnessed, and that silence marked the end of one moment and the beginning of another, because the assumptions that once filled the room had been replaced by questions, curiosity, and respect, and nothing would return to how it was before. This was only the second step in a journey that had been long and lonely, and while the boy could not yet see where it would lead, he felt something shift inside him, a small, steady confidence that grew not from applause, but from the courage to be seen and heard on his own terms. The silence after the boy stepped away from the piano felt heavier than the laughter that had come before, and people remained frozen in their places, unsure of what reaction was appropriate, because clapping felt too simple and speaking felt too loud. And in that stillness, many of them began to reflect on their own behavior and the ease with which they had judged someone without knowing his story. And the boy stood quietly near the side of the room, holding his hands together again, returning to the posture that had always kept him safe. A man near the center of the hall finally stood up slowly, not to make a speech, but to look more closely at the boy, and his expression had changed from confidence to uncertainty, and he asked gently where the boy had learned to play. And the question carried genuine curiosity rather than mockery, and the boy answered softly, explaining that he practiced whenever he could, and that he learned by listening and repeating, and his voice was calm without pride or shame, because music for him was not something to boast about, but something he lived with daily. Others began to join the conversation, and their questions came carefully now, as if they feared causing harm, and they asked how long he had been playing and whether he had teachers. And when they heard that he had learned mostly on his own, a quiet respect spread through the room, and several people exchanged looks, realizing that discipline and dedication often grow strongest in places where opportunity is limited. The boy noticed the change in their tone and posture, And though he remained cautious, he felt a small sense of validation not because they were impressed, but because they were listening. And for the first time he felt that his presence mattered beyond curiosity, and this feeling was unfamiliar yet grounding. And it allowed him to stand a little taller without losing his humility. A woman who had laughed earlier approached him slowly and apologized in a low voice, explaining that she had not meant to be unkind. And the boy nodded, accepting the apology without hesitation. Because he understood that people often act from ignorance rather than cruelty, and he had learned that forgiveness could be a form of strength rather than weakness. As the room slowly returned to motion, the energy remained different, and conversations took on a quieter tone. And the boy was invited to sit with a small group who wanted to hear more about his love for music. And he shared stories of late nights practicing in empty buildings and the comfort music brought during difficult times. And his words painted a picture of resilience that moved those listening even more deeply than his playing had. The organizers of the gathering took notice as well, and they spoke among themselves about how unexpected moments often reveal the true purpose of events. And one of them approached the boy, offering him the chance to play again later if he wished. And the boy hesitated, not because he lacked confidence, but because he understood the weight of attention, and he chose to say that he would think about it, showing a maturity beyond his years. As time passed, the boy observed how people treated him differently now. And while the change was subtle, it was meaningful, and they made space for him, asked for his opinion, and spoke to him as an individual rather than an interruption. And this shift confirmed something he had always felt, that respect is not granted by appearance, but earned through authenticity and courage. In a quiet corner of the hall, a man who had been among the loudest voices earlier sat alone, reflecting on his reaction. And he felt a deep sense of discomfort, realizing how easily he had joined the laughter without considering its impact. And he watched the boy from a distance, noticing the calm dignity with which he carried himself. And this observation stirred a desire to change something within himself, though he was not yet sure how. The boy eventually stepped outside the hall for a moment to breathe, and the air felt cool and grounding, and he closed his eyes briefly, letting the sounds of the city surround him. And in that moment he felt proud, not in a loud way but in a steady, quiet way, because he had honored the part of himself that mattered most, and he had done so without anger or defiance. When he returned inside, the atmosphere felt warmer and more open, and someone brought him a glass of water and thanked him for sharing his music, and the boy accepted with a gentle smile, understanding that gratitude shared sincerely can build bridges where silence once stood. As the gathering continued, the boy remained present, but no longer felt the need to prove anything, and he understood that this moment was not an ending but a beginning, and that the path ahead would still hold challenges and doubt. But he also knew that he carried something valuable within him that could not be taken away by laughter or neglect. People in the room would remember this day not because of the surprise alone, but because it forced them to confront their assumptions and recognize the quiet power of perseverance. And the boy would remember it as the moment he allowed himself to be seen and heard without fear. And that memory would stay with him, shaping the choices he made and the confidence he carried into the next chapter of his life. The days after the gathering unfolded slowly, yet they carried a quiet intensity that stayed with the boy and everyone who had been present, because what happened in that hall did not end when the doors closed, and the boy returned to his everyday life, which still involved long walks, modest meals, and responsibilities beyond his years. And yet something within him had shifted, because he now carried the memory of being heard, and that memory softened the weight of routine without changing its reality. At home, his parent noticed the difference immediately, not in words but in posture and calm, and when the boy shared what had happened, he did so simply without exaggeration, because he had learned that truth does not need decoration. And his parent listened carefully, pride and concern mixed together. Because while the music brought joy, it also exposed the boy to a world that could be generous or cruel without warning. Life continued with the same challenges and the same limits, and the boy still practiced quietly whenever he could, sometimes on borrowed instruments, sometimes only on imagined keys traced on worn tables. And he did not suddenly expect doors to open, because he understood that one moment of recognition does not erase years of struggle. And this realism kept him grounded and patient. Word of the event traveled slowly through conversations rather than announcements, and a few people who had been present spoke about the boy with a tone of respect and curiosity. And this reached others who had not been there, and some questioned the story, while others felt intrigued by the idea that talent could appear in such an unexpected form. And this quiet spread of awareness marked the beginning of a subtle change in how the boy was seen within the community. One afternoon, he was invited to visit a small local music center, not as a performer, but as a guest, and the invitation surprised him because it was offered gently without pressure. And when he arrived, he was met by people who spoke to him with care and interest rather than assumption, and they asked about his relationship with music rather than his background, and this approach made him feel safe enough to speak honestly. He played briefly in that space, not to impress but to share, and the response was warm and thoughtful. And one of the instructors offered to let him practice there when the rooms were free. And this simple act of trust meant more to him than praise, because it gave him access and consistency, which were things he had rarely known, and he accepted with gratitude and humility. Returning home that evening, he reflected on how small acts of kindness can change the direction of a life, and he resolved not to let pride or fear interfere with his growth. And he reminded himself that opportunity requires responsibility and discipline, and that he must continue to show up with respect for the craft and for himself. Meanwhile, some of the adults who had laughed at him found themselves thinking about the moment more often than expected, and it unsettled them because it challenged beliefs they had carried unconsciously. And one man in particular began noticing how quickly he dismissed people who did not fit his idea of success. And this awareness brought discomfort, but also a desire to be more mindful in his judgments. The boy did not know about these reflections, yet their impact would be felt over time as attitudes shifted subtly and interactions softened, and this change did not revolve around him alone, but around a broader recognition that worth and potential cannot be measured by appearance or circumstance, and that lesson lingered quietly in the community. At school, the boy remained the same attentive, reserved student, and his teachers noticed his focus and resilience, and one teacher who had attended the gathering encouraged him to continue nurturing his gift while also protecting his balance and well-being, and this guidance helped him understand that growth must be sustainable rather than rushed. There were moments of doubt as well, because increased attention can bring new fears, and the boy sometimes wondered whether he would disappoint those who now believed in him. And during these moments, he returned to the reason he played music in the first place, which was not to meet expectations, but to express something honest and personal, and this clarity helped him release pressure and return to simplicity. He continued practicing daily, not measuring progress by speed or complexity, but by consistency and feeling, and each session strengthened his connection to music and to himself. And he learned that patience is not passive but active, and that steady effort builds resilience more reliably than sudden recognition. As weeks passed, the memory of laughter faded further, replaced by a quiet respect and curiosity, and the boy moved forward carrying both humility and confidence in balance. And he understood that his journey was still at an early stage, and that challenges would come, yet he felt prepared because he had learned that his voice mattered, and that he could choose when and how to share it. This period of transition was not marked by dramatic change, but by steady alignment and growth, and it laid the foundation for what would come next, because the boy was no longer defined solely by circumstance, but by intention and the understanding that true strength often reveals itself slowly through consistency, courage, and quiet dedication. The next phase of the boy life unfolded with both hope and caution moving side by side, because new possibilities often arrive carrying uncertainty along with promise. And he learned quickly that growth requires steadiness more than excitement, and each morning he continued his routine, helping at home, attending school, and finding time to practice whenever space allowed. And this consistency became his anchor as the world around him slowly shifted. The music center welcomed him regularly, and the rooms where he practiced became a place of calm and focus. And he treated every session with respect, arriving early, warming up carefully, and listening closely to the sound he produced. And this discipline did not come from pressure, but from gratitude, because access to an instrument felt like a gift he did not want to waste, and the instructors noticed his dedication and offered guidance gently without overwhelming him. He listened carefully to advice and applied it patiently, understanding that improvement comes from attention rather than force. And he asked thoughtful questions, showing curiosity rather than insecurity, and this approach built trust and allowed him to learn in a way that honored his natural pace. And his progress became visible not through dramatic leaps, but through subtle control and deeper expression. Outside the music center, his life remained modest, and he continued to face challenges common to his circumstances. And there were days when fatigue made practice difficult, and moments when doubt whispered that he did not belong in spaces that celebrated talent and refinement. And during these times, he returned to simple pieces that reminded him why he began playing in the first place, and this grounding helped him maintain perspective. People in the community began to recognize him not as a surprise, but as a presence, and this shift mattered because it reduced the burden of expectation and allowed genuine relationships to form, and some adults offered encouragement, while others simply treated him with normal kindness. And this balance helped him feel included rather than elevated or isolated. A small opportunity arose when the music center organized a modest recital for students and invited him to participate, and the invitation stirred anxiety because performing again meant being seen and evaluated, and he considered declining. But after thoughtful reflection, he chose to accept because he understood that courage grows through action rather than avoidance. And he prepared carefully, choosing a piece that reflected sincerity rather than show. The day of the recital arrived, and the room was filled with families, friends, and a few members of the community, and the atmosphere felt supportive and calm. And when his turn came, he walked to the piano with steady steps and took a moment to breathe before beginning. And the music flowed naturally, guided by emotion and focus. And the response was warm and respectful. And this experience reinforced his belief that performance could be a shared moment rather than a test. After the recital, conversations followed, and people thanked him for his playing and some asked about his journey, and he answered honestly without embellishment, and his openness resonated because it reflected resilience without bitterness and ambition without arrogance. And this authenticity continued to shape how others perceived him and how he perceived himself. At home, his parent remained a source of steady support, reminding him to rest to stay balanced, and to value education alongside music. And this guidance helped him avoid the trap of defining himself by a single talent. And he appreciated the reminder that identity can be layered and evolving rather than fixed and narrow. Not every interaction was easy, because some people still carried assumptions and expectations that felt heavy. And the boy learned to navigate these moments with grace, listening, without absorbing pressure, and choosing boundaries when needed. And this emotional skill proved as important as musical technique in sustaining his growth. A conversation with an instructor stayed with him when he was told that success is not a straight line, and that patience protects joy, and these words settled deeply, because they validated the pace he had chosen and the balance he maintained, and he carried this perspective into his practice and decisions. As months passed, his confidence strengthened quietly, and he began experimenting with composition, exploring sounds that reflected his experiences and emotions. And this creative exploration allowed him to express aspects of himself that performance alone could not capture. And it deepened his relationship with music as a living language rather than a fixed set of skills. The community continued to evolve as well, and the story of the boy who played with quiet strength inspired reflection among adults and children alike. And some parents encouraged their children to explore interests beyond expectations, and some teachers revisited how they assessed potential and effort. And while these changes were subtle, they represented a broader shift toward empathy and openness. The boy remained attentive to these changes without becoming attached to recognition, and he understood that influence carries responsibility, and he chose to lead through example rather than instruction. And this choice preserved his humility and allowed his journey to remain grounded. There were evenings when he returned to the hall where the first gathering took place, and he would sit quietly near the piano, remembering the laughter, the silence, and the courage it took to play. And these reflections did not stir resentment but gratitude, because they marked the beginning of a path he now walked with intention. As this period drew to a close, he felt a growing sense of alignment between who he was and who he was becoming, and he recognized that this alignment was built through daily choices, patience, and self-respect. And he carried this understanding forward, ready to face what came next with steady confidence and an open heart. As the boy continued along his path, he began to notice that growth was not always comfortable, and that even positive change could bring moments of inner conflict and uncertainty. And while music had opened doors, it had also exposed him to expectations that he had never faced before. And learning how to carry those expectations without losing himself became an important lesson during this stage of his journey. At the music center, he was offered more advanced guidance, and with it came the challenge of refining technique while preserving emotional honesty. And he learned that technical skill alone was not enough, and that true music requires vulnerability, patience, and the courage to feel deeply. And these lessons were not taught through strict instruction, but through observation, listening, and thoughtful feedback that respected his individuality. There were days when practice felt heavy and progress seemed slow, and on those days he questioned whether he was moving forward or simply standing still. And during such moments, he remembered the long nights of silent practice in empty buildings, and he realized that patience had always been his strength, and that growth often happens quietly before it becomes visible. The instructors encouraged him to explore different styles and traditions, and this exploration expanded his understanding of music as a shared human language shaped by culture, struggle, and joy. And he listened carefully to recordings, studied patterns, and experimented with expression. And through this process, he discovered new ways to communicate emotion without relying on volume or speed. Outside the music center, his school life continued with its usual demands, and balancing responsibilities required careful time management and self-awareness. And there were evenings when exhaustion tempted him to skip practice, but he learned to listen to his body and mind, choosing rest when needed and returning to the piano with renewed focus rather than forcing progress. Some classmates began to see him differently, and while most were kind, a few expressed envy or disbelief. And these reactions tested his emotional resilience, and he learned that not everyone would understand his journey, and that seeking universal approval was neither realistic nor healthy. And this understanding helped him remain centered and kind without compromising his boundaries. A meaningful moment came when he was invited to assist in a beginner music class, helping younger students become familiar with the piano. And this role challenged him in unexpected ways, because teaching required clarity, patience, and empathy. And as he guided others, he deepened his own understanding and gained confidence in his ability to communicate beyond performance. Watching younger students struggle and improve reminded him of his own early days and reinforced his gratitude for every opportunity he had received. And he approached this responsibility with humility, never positioning himself as superior, but as someone who had walked a similar path and was willing to share what he had learned. The experience of mentoring also revealed the impact of encouragement and how small words of support can shape confidence, and he became more mindful of how he spoke to others, choosing kindness and honesty over comparison and judgment. And this awareness extended beyond music, influencing how he interacted with peers, family, and community members. During this period, he faced a personal setback when an important practice session was interrupted due to circumstances beyond his control, and frustration threatened to overwhelm him, because he had invested effort and expectation into that time. And through reflection, he learned to release control over what he could not change, and to adapt with grace and flexibility. This setback became a quiet turning point, because it taught him that resilience is not only about persistence, but also about adaptability and self-compassion. And he carried this lesson forward, allowing it to inform how he responded to future challenges and disappointments. The community continued to watch his progress with interest, yet the attention felt less intense and more supportive. And this shift allowed him to breathe and focus on growth rather than perception. And he appreciated this change because it aligned with his desire to move steadily rather than dramatically. At home, conversations with his parent deepened, and they spoke openly about hope's fears and the future, and these conversations grounded him, reminding him that while music was important, it was one part of a larger life, and maintaining balance would protect his well-being and sustain his passion over time. As this stage of his journey progressed, he felt a quiet confidence taking root, not built on praise or recognition, but on consistency, self-awareness, and effort. And he understood that confidence grows from honoring commitments to oneself and showing up even when motivation fluctuates. He began setting small personal goals, not to impress others, but to challenge himself gently, and these goals provided direction without pressure, and allowed him to celebrate progress without comparing it to anyone else. And this approach nurtured a healthy relationship with ambition. Looking back, he recognized how far he had come since the day of laughter in the hall, and he felt gratitude rather than resentment, because that moment had revealed his strength and set him on a path of self-discovery and growth. And he carried this perspective forward, ready to face the next chapter with maturity, patience, and an open heart. This period taught him that becoming oneself is a gradual process shaped by effort, reflection, and resilience, and that true progress often unfolds quietly, supported by those who believe in growth over glory. And he stepped into the future grounded, confident, and prepared for the lessons still ahead. As time moved forward, the boy entered a stage of deeper reflection where growth was no longer just about learning new skills, but about understanding who he was becoming and what kind of life he would build around his music and his values. And this stage felt quieter on the surface but stronger underneath, because it was shaped by intention rather than reaction. He became more selective with opportunities, choosing those that aligned with his sense of balance and purpose, and declining others without guilt. And this decision marked an important shift, because he no longer felt the need to prove his worth through constant visibility, and instead trusted that steady effort would create its own path, and this trust brought him peace. At the music center, he was now treated as a serious student, and discussions became more thoughtful, focusing on interpretation, emotion, and long-term development. And he appreciated this change because it respected his maturity and his willingness to learn, and he responded by practicing with deeper awareness, listening not only to sound, but to silence and intention. There were moments when he felt the weight of responsibility, especially when younger students looked up to him as an example. And he approached this role carefully, reminding himself that leadership is not about perfection, but about honesty and consistency. And when he made mistakes, he acknowledged them openly, showing that growth includes humility and self-correction. One meaningful experience came when he was asked to perform at a small gathering meant to raise awareness for access to arts education. And the cause resonated deeply with him because it reflected his own journey. And he prepared with care, choosing music that told a story of perseverance without bitterness and hope without exaggeration. During that performance, he noticed how the audience listened not with surprise, but with understanding, and this shift touched him deeply, because it showed that his music was no longer received as an exception, but as an expression, and this recognition felt more sustainable and grounding than the initial shock he had once witnessed. After the event, conversations followed that were thoughtful and sincere, and people spoke about how the music made them reflect on their own assumptions and choices. And the boy listened quietly, understanding that influence can be subtle and far-reaching, and that sharing truth through art can open doors within people rather than impress them momentarily. At school, he continued to balance responsibilities, and his teachers supported his growth while encouraging him to remain engaged in all aspects of learning. And this holistic approach helped him develop discipline and curiosity beyond music, and reinforced the idea that creativity and education can support each other rather than compete. He faced moments of doubt when comparing his path to those who had more resources or clearer structures. And during these moments, he returned to the grounding practices he had developed, breathing, reflecting, and reconnecting with the simple joy of playing. And these habits helped him release comparison and stay present. His relationship with his parent grew deeper through shared conversations about resilience, gratitude, and choice. And these discussions reinforced the importance of values and integrity, and he felt supported, not pressured. And this emotional safety allowed him to take risks thoughtfully without fear of losing connection. The community continued to evolve in quiet ways, and more children were encouraged to explore music regardless of background. And while the boy did not claim responsibility for this shift, he recognized that stories have power, and that his journey had become part of a larger conversation about access and empathy. He began to think more about the future, not in terms of fame or success, but in terms of contribution and sustainability. And he asked himself how he could continue growing while also giving back, and these questions guided his decisions and helped him stay aligned with his purpose. As he looked back on the laughter that once filled the hall, he no longer felt pain or resentment, and instead saw it as a moment of awakening, not only for himself, but for others. And this reframing allowed him to carry gratitude rather than anger, and it strengthened his emotional resilience. This stage of his journey taught him that true confidence is quiet and rooted in self-respect, and that progress is measured not by how many people watch, but by how deeply one listens and responds. And he carried this understanding forward, ready for the final stretch of growth with patience, clarity, and an open sense of possibility. The final phase of the boy journey arrived not with noise or celebration, but with a calm sense of arrival that felt steady and earned, and he did not wake up one day feeling different. Yet over time, he noticed that his choices, his thoughts, and his reactions carried a quiet confidence that had not been there before. And this confidence was not rooted in praise or recognition, but in self-trust built slowly through effort, patience, and honesty. Music was now woven naturally into his life rather than standing apart from it, and he practiced with intention, not driven by fear of falling behind, but by curiosity and respect for the craft. And when he played, he listened closely to himself, noticing how emotion, technique, and silence worked together. And this awareness allowed him to express more with less effort and more clarity. He continued helping younger students and mentoring when asked, and these moments reminded him of how far he had come and how important guidance can be when offered with humility and care. And he never positioned himself as someone who had arrived, but as someone still learning, and this openness kept his relationships genuine and grounded. Opportunities continued to appear quietly, and he evaluated each one carefully, considering how it fit into his life and values. And he learned that saying no can be as important as saying yes, because it protects focus and well-being. And this discernment marked his growth from reacting to directing his path with intention. At home, life remained simple and supportive, and conversations with his parent reflected mutual respect and understanding. And together they navigated plans for the future, balancing dreams with practical considerations. And these discussions reinforced the idea that growth does not require abandoning stability, and that ambition can coexist with care and responsibility. One meaningful moment came when he returned to the same hall where he had once been, laughed at not as a challenge or curiosity, but as a participant in a community event. And as he walked through the space, he felt calm rather than nervous, and he noticed how the memory no longer held power over him, and this realization felt like closure and freedom. He played that day with ease and sincerity, and the audience listened attentively, and when the music ended, the response was warm and respectful, and he accepted it with gratitude without attaching his sense of worth to it. And this balance confirmed that he had reached a place of emotional maturity that would support him through future successes and setbacks alike. After the event, he spent time reflecting not on how far he might go, but on how he wanted to live, and he understood that fulfillment comes from alignment between values, actions, and purpose. And this clarity brought peace, because it removed the pressure to chase validation, and allowed him to focus on contribution and growth. The community around him continued to change slowly, and more people became aware of the importance of access, encouragement, and patience. And while he never claimed to be the cause, he recognized that lived examples can inspire reflection, and he remained mindful of the responsibility that comes with being visible. As he looked ahead, he saw a future that was open rather than defined, and this openness excited him, because it allowed room for learning, exploration, and evolution. And he felt prepared to meet that future with curiosity rather than fear, and with resilience rather than urgency. The boy who had once been judged by his clothes and silence now carried himself with quiet assurance, and his journey stood as a reminder that talent often grows unseen, and that dignity is not granted by others but cultivated from within, and this understanding anchored him deeply. He continued walking forward, carrying music as a companion rather than a destination, and he trusted that as long as he remained honest, patient, and present, his path would unfold in meaningful ways. And this trust was the greatest achievement of all. The story did not end with applause, recognition, or dramatic change, but with continuity, because real growth does not conclude, it continues. And the boy stepped into the next chapter of his life steady, grounded, and unafraid, ready to listen, learn, and live with intention and quiet strength.